James Phelps, a wide-shouldered tall man in a suit, was going to a business meeting, rubbing his hands together in anticipation of big money. Putting into an expensive leather briefcase documents, like a child, he rejoiced that fate had sent him Randall Wheeler. He had never dreamed of such a companion. He was so deft at handling business. And the income in the year of their partnership had increased significantly. He could have been thinking about having a family. After all, he was over 30, and he did not want to become an old father. It was preferable to see your children grow up, go out into the world, have grandchildren. So James clearly did not support the modern trend of having children when your own temples were gray, referring to the fact that you were not yet ready and had not enough time to get married. Except that there were some difficulties with applicants. Because he had seen through the candidates and often made them test their feelings for him, the girls always failed miserably, proving that the girls were only interested in his money. He wanted a modest and decent girl who cared about the home and the bright flame of love in it. But such ladies were hard to find, especially in high society. The ladies there are shrewd, and they are mainly concerned that their hairdresser is not cheaper than their friends. James, for example, despite the fact that he had risen quite well in recent years, did not even have a housekeeper, preferring to manage the household on his own. After all, he came from a simple family that was not afraid of hard work, and even on the contrary, loved it. Thus, reflecting on his daily life, he finally got out of the apartment, once again checking to make sure that he had all the documents. When he came down to the ground floor at the entrance, the man was pleased to look up at the windows of his elite 4-room apartment on the top floor. The luxurious car parked in the parking lot was also a joy to the eye. He was going to it when suddenly he felt a light touch on his hand. James looked around and saw a poorly dressed girl about 8 years old. From her appearance, you could tell at once that she was a common beggar. Already, James was getting ready to hear her ask for money, but instead, the girl said something completely different. Something that made him sit down stunned on the bench and think hard. Driving to meet Randall Wheeler was no longer a question of the day. Many years before these events, James was in the same high spirits. He was much younger then, and his life was radically different than it is now. He was not, however, in any way affected his feelings. Even though he was not very rich, living with his mother in a cramped little apartment, while working in an ordinary job as a programmer at a small computer firm. But at the same time, he had a much greater and dearer happiness in life. His beloved girl Sydney, to whom he had already proposed. The only thing left to do is to set a wedding day. Today, James and Sydney were going to take a long walk together along the embankment of a turbulent mountain river in one of the parks of a tiny town lost in the mountains. It was an incredibly beautiful town. Not a few tourists came to it, but unfortunately there were few jobs there. She had graduated from the pedagogical university and had lived with her retired grandmother for a long time, actually on her grandmother's pension. The girl did not want to make that burden with her actual sponging, so she and her young man immediately after the wedding were going to the capital to start a new life and more favorable conditions. But Sydney did not even know yet what the snag was in the execution of such a seemingly simple decision. To get married and leave with her beloved in search of a better life. It was all about her grandmother, Dulcie Bailey. The pensioner was already in her 80s, and of course, she loved her granddaughter and wished the best for her. However, the old lady did not see her future with James, and that is because she did not trust this guy. She did not see him as a reliable protection and support for her granddaughter. After all, in his youth, James was a weirdo, had problems with law enforcement, hooliganism, and had not a very good reputation, and although a long time ago took up for the mind guy, becoming a real goody-goody. Learned, worked, but still. Dulcie already had an unpleasant image of James. He's become famous all over town, which means it's too late to backtrack and play the angel. He who broke the law once would do it again and again. That was the old lady's opinion, and she was not going to change it, as she had repeatedly told her granddaughter. Sydney, you're going to have a hard time with this guy, so break up with him before it's too late. Look at how many good, hard-working guys there are around who would carry you in their arms, and you're clinging to this James like he's honey dude. "Oh, Grandma, stop saying that. James loves me very much, and I love him. What was in his life is over, and he is quite different now," answered the girl in love. In general, the different generations could not find a common ground, but fortunately, it did not come to a scandal. Everyone just stuck to his or her own opinion. Most likely, Sydney would have left after her beloved had they not gone on an unfortunate walk, which would have been the last one for them. On that beautiful summer evening, nothing foretold trouble. There was not a cloud in the sky, and the air was filled with the wonderful aroma of subtropical greenery. James took Sydney's hand and led her deep into the shady path along the waterfront, telling her about his plans to move. "We'll rent an apartment in the beginning. My savings are enough for the first time. And as soon as we decide on a place to live, we'll start looking for a job. The good thing is that I have some income, which I earn online, remotely. I do not think that the finances will be a problem. I hope that in the end, you will not have to work. After all, it is the man's duty to provide the family," the guy said slyly, looking at his beloved. "I fully rely on you in this matter, and I hope everything will be fine. But I'm worried about grandmother, how she will be alone here." Sydney answered him, only harder clutching the hand of her beloved in her little palm. "What's the big deal? We'll settle down and take her in. I like her. It is obvious that she is a very well-read person, and Dulcie has a good sense of humor despite her respectable age." Sydney did not tell her fiancé what she thought of him, so as not to upset the guy. Of course, Dulcie would never go to live with a man she hated. So, chatting nicely, the young people had almost reached the very end of the embankment when suddenly disaster occurred. There was a terrible rumble in the mountains above them, and the ground trembled. Nothing unusual about this phenomenon. After all, they lived in an earthquake-prone area, and small earthquakes occurred periodically in their area. But this time, apparently, nature decided to gather its forces, and spewing curses, it brought down a powerful mudslide on the town. It swept away everything in its path, approaching the place where the couple were staying with incredible speed. Tragically, Sydney and James were right in the path, and it was too late to flee. The way back was cut off by a wide crevice blocking the road, and ahead was a winding, raging river. Before they could even blink, they were swept into the river by a mudslide. The lovers' hands parted, and just as soon as they shouted how much they loved each other, the torrent swallowed them both up. A week passed. As best as he could, leaning on a stick, James hurried to his beloved's house. He injured his leg in the mudslide, hitting the rocky river bottom, but still managed to get out on the bank. There, he was found by rescuers, who took James to the hospital. He was terribly worried about his life companion, so as soon as he was able to move, immediately and rushed to Sydney home. But the girl was not at home. The door was opened to him by Dulcie Bailey, dressed in all black. He didn't know that she had seen him from afar through the window, so he dressed accordingly. "What about Sydney? Where is she?" he blurted out. "I warned Sydney so many times not to go with you, and now she's gone. She's dead because of you. You took her to that miserable park, and her death is on your shoulders." The old woman literally screamed. At these words, everything blurred for poor James. Indeed, he felt guilty about his beloved's death. He'd managed to go to the park, since Sydney had offered to sit in the cafe. He sank to the floor of the stairwell in shock and distress. Muffled sobs shook the young man's shoulders, and the old grandmother relentlessly poured curses on him, after which she slammed the door, saying that he did not even deserve to see her grave. Unable to endure such pain, on the same day, James left for the capital, sinking into himself for a long time. The poor man did not know that everything his bride's grandmother had told him was a lie. All this time, also, the wounded girl was in the hospital, very close to the groom. And just as unaware of him, until a few days later, Dulcie told her the same story that her fiancé had died, swallowed by a mudslide. Only by taking a sin on her soul did the pensioner see the possibility of separating the couple and keeping her granddaughter with her. After Sydney came home from the hospital, she was grief-stricken for a long time, but she soon pulled herself together because she had someone to live for. Under her heart, she was carrying the child of James, about whom she decided not to tell her grandmother yet, because she had a weak heart. But she did not have time to tell her grandmother about it. Apparently, God punished the wily pensioner for her despicable act. She did not live a month after that and died of a heart attack. Of course, Sydney could not live in the city where she had lost her two closest people in such a short time, and so, having sold her apartments, as well as her fiancé, she went to look for a good fortune in a foreign land. She wanted to buy an old house somewhere in the suburbs, so that she could get to work by train after she placed her unborn daughter in kindergarten. But in the meantime, she could live in the dormitory from the job she had found. Except, as it turned out, all her misfortunes were still ahead for her. It has been 3 years since Sydney gave birth to her daughter, Clara. All this time, she had been living in the dormitory of the cannery, where she had worked as a common laborer for only a few months. The director stepped in and gave her a room. She lived on her allowance, savings, and small part-time jobs as a seamstress. And then came a real black streak of bad luck for the girl. It all started with the fact that in the church, where she was praying for the soul of her fiancé and grandmother, she met a kind and happy woman, who after talking to her and finding out that she was all alone in this world, and that she dreamed of her own house, offered to help Gwenda to buy property. Unfortunately, Sydney trusted her, but she turned out to be a swindler and deceived her by registering the house in her own name. She appealed to the law enforcement authorities, but they did not find any criminal intent in the actions of the swindler, because Sydney did not even have a receipt. So overnight, the mother and daughter were left without savings, and then they also found themselves without a place to live, because the nephew of one of the factory bosses needed a room. Sydney was desperate when she found herself on the street with a baby in her arms. She had nowhere else to go but back to the temple to ask God for help, because even though she met the one who left her without a penny, she had not lost her faith in God, and this time he did hear her prayers, sending a kind pensioner to meet her. Gregory O'Brien lived in the city in his own comfortable apartment, but in the village he had an old shack which, because of its dilapidated and squalid condition, did not interest even his heirs. It was here that the grandfather offered to stay to his mother with the baby in her arms. Moreover, the train went there, though it took 2 hours to get to Sydney to work, but it was the only way out for her. Since then, she and Clara began to live in a remote village. As the years passed, Sydney still worked at the cannery, but as an accountant. But her salary did not allow her to rent an apartment on the outskirts of the city. To be exact, it would have been allowed if her daughter had not discovered some health problems. So, she had to spend a considerable part of her salary. She tried her best to help her daughter, and even took part-time work on the assembly line, but it was not enough. An expensive foreign drug that could help the baby cost too much. Clara was a precocious child, beautiful and swarthy, except that she had to wear glasses because of her illness. Seeing how hard her mother worked, one day the girl decided to help, and now every day after school, instead of waiting for her mother from work in the park nearby, she took her little pipe and went to play in the crosswalk, hoping to collect a larger sum. Passers-by took pity on the little beggar and very often put coins and small bills into her hats. Thus, of course, the girl could not help her mother much, but she still believed in the best. One day, as usual, Clara was walking to the crossing when passing an expensive car. She suddenly heard a muffled conversation between two men, one of whom at that moment got out from under the car. Clara followed. The men paid no attention to the little beggar. "Well done, Bull. Now, the businessman will be up in the air as soon as he arrives to negotiate with his companion. You really can't choose your friends, for if he knew what kind of a man Randall Wheeler was, he wasn't in the penitentiary with us for nothing. Come on, stop ranting. He pays well, and the rest is none of our business," said his partner, still looking back at Clara. But when he saw that it appeared to be some little girl, he immediately lost interest. The men continued on their way, while Clara hurriedly ran to the car to wait for her master. James was very surprised when the little beggar told him not to go to the negotiations, because some uncles had put something in his car that would make the whole neighborhood remember it. The businessman believed her, and just in case called the police, who recovered the infernal machine from underneath, counting out his last moments of life. But the most important thing was that while they were waiting for the police, James had time to question the beggar about where she had come from. The girl told the truth, and at the same time showed a picture of her mother, making the man's heart flutter. Sydney was even more surprised than James when an unknown man called her and thanked her for saving her daughter's life, saying that after the police were settled, he would personally bring Clara home. Randall Wheeler and his associates were arrested the same day. Never would his companion have imagined that such an honorable man would do such a thing for money. Already in the morning, terrified for her daughter, Sydney was stunned when a motorcade of wedding cars drove up to her house. And out of the first one, her daughter emerged triumphantly, accompanied by James, her James, alive and unharmed. The lovers threw themselves into each other's arms, and Clara stood beside them, not yet knowing who the uncle was. "Will you marry me?" was the only thing James could whisper. "Yes," was her answer. How many things the poor woman and her daughter had to endure, and yet happiness returned to her. Even the swindler Gwenda, after serious people talked to her, had to return the embezzled money. Sydney did not hold a grudge against her granddaughter, knowing full well that she wanted her to be happy. When the whole family spoke about it at the old woman's grave, the clear sky had suddenly covered with a small cloud, from which a few drops of rain fell, and it was a sign, so Dulcie Bailey begged forgiveness for what she had done.